Test, test, test. Here we go for the second half of Unit 15, dealing with Cold War. For Lesson 15b, we're going to deal with Cold War in the West. So Western Europe, the United States, is really the place that we're looking at here. So how did what we looked at last time in Cold War in the East change with or connect with what was going on in the other parts of the world? You're going to finish up chapter 27, or read chapter 27 in this one, and that is pages 860 through 868. So if you take a look at those, and of course as you're looking, look for these words specifically. We're looking for welfare state, bloc, and that is actually spelled right, B-L-O-C. That's a different type than B-L-O-C-K. Women's liberation movement, and student revolt. So if you'd look for those terms and how they're used, that would be great. So certainly we looked at, after World War II, that there was a very, very large difference between the West versus the East. And this is now the new definition of what's going on in the world, the power sharing structure after World War II and all the way up until about 1990. And really most of the world, whether you lived in Eastern Europe or Western Europe or even Africa or Asia, was aligned with one side or the other. It broke down essentially to capitalism, that's the West, with the United States as its kind of major superpower, versus communism, and that's the East, with the Soviet Union as the major superpower. And the U.S., along with Western Europe, is known as the West. The USSR, that's the Soviet Union, along with Eastern Europe, is known as the Eastern Bloc, or the East. So when we're talking about those kind of terminology, you need to understand what part of the world geographically we're dealing with. Well, we saw that Germany was divided after World War II, and we know that there was some sort of conflict surrounding Berlin, and that the Allies had to bring in material by the air to supply that city. So let's take a look more specifically at West Germany. West Germany, of course, is the part that's controlled by the U.S. and the British and the French, and in 1949, that is unified into a new country called West Germany. So no longer is it kind of controlled by these other countries. It's now given its own country. West German leaders cooperate with its other Western neighbors in the United States and essentially allow the rebuilding to occur and unemployment fall to 0%. Now, these days, with Nevada's unemployment sitting at about 10%, that sounds pretty good. And they were able to do a lot of pretty important things. They brought a lot of people in to help increase either productivity or to help out with areas of the world that they didn't, or of the economy that they didn't know about. At the same time that West Germany is increasing in power, Great Britain, England, is declining in power. Certainly it ends World War II with huge economic problems. It's put everything it has into trying to win this war and stay afloat. Its infrastructure is crumbling after being bombed by the Germans in the early part of the war. And it develops into what's called a modern welfare state to assist citizens both economically and socially. But the costs of rebuilding its nation and developing this welfare state forces Great Britain to close or reduce its huge empire. At one point, the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire, that there was something controlled by the British all the way around the world. Well, that essentially ends. And this is kind of the ending point of England's role as a world power that's gone on all the way since about the 1500s. Pretty much from the beginning of this semester, as we've talked about all these different things, Great Britain and England have been a major player, and this is kind of the end of that. So it's a sad note if you're English, but the power is shifting, certainly overseas, to the United States. We're also seeing more unity or connectivity within Western Europe than we've ever seen before. There's a desire to compete economically, but these are all kind of held in check by treaties where people are starting to work together. It becomes an us versus them. We know that the Soviet Union is over there, and we need to make sure that we are powerful economically and socially against that. So a number of different treaties, things like, for example, the European Economic Community, are developed to try to make free trade important and powerful within the borders of Western Europe. So something different a little bit than what we've talked about before, but definitely an issue that's going on within the Cold War era is the fact that we're starting to see some upheaval within the West, specifically mostly within the United States, dealing with race. Race has been an issue within the United States for a long time, but really the changes that happen after World War II open the door for a new discussion of racial equality within the United States. And it goes something like this. If African American soldiers can die for the United States overseas fighting someone who is obviously a brutal racist in Adolf Hitler, how is it that they cannot have the same rights as white Americans here at home? And it's a powerful argument, and it starts to open up some of these dialogues. And of course, we also have a couple of very, very powerful leaders of the black community in Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X that start to discuss this on a national stage. King's approach, which is nonviolent after Gandhi, certainly appeals to the liberal whites and, at that point, President Johnson. Now, King is assassinated in 1968. Malcolm X is also assassinated. So we have the upheaval doesn't stop, but we are starting to see some movement towards more racial equality in the United States during this time. At the same time, we're seeing some protests against the American government based on how it is waging this Cold War, specifically how it's waging the Cold War in Vietnam. So we have a number of Americans, the young specifically, since they're generally the ones that are being sent over to fight, that are questioning our role for why we are in Vietnam. The reason is that we're trying to stop, ostensibly, the spread of communism, but most Americans don't see why any American soldier should be dying in this place that many couldn't even find on a map. So this becomes an area of protest that gets more and more powerful as the 60s go on. Kind of the high point or low point, depending on how you look at it, happens at a small college in Ohio called Kent State University, where 4 nonviolent protesters are killed by National Guard troops for protesting against the Vietnam War. A lot of Americans, because of this upheaval, have a real desire to return to more law and order, and we see a real divided America during this time frame. Women, too, along with different races, are looking for equal rights. And so there's, again, World War II becomes the catalyst for that. Women participated in helping the American allies win World War II, essentially, and want to continue to have that important place in society. So we see in the 1950s more and more women moving into the workforce, and they have a concern about the fact that they're not being treated equally within the workforce. The idea that men and women have different pay scales, different job responsibilities, doesn't sit well with most women. Also, there's a new growth of something called feminism, which is the rights movement for women that becomes the voice of trying to change the way that women have been treated in the past. And we also see a rise, too, in female authors and activists that are kind of beating the drum of women's liberation and women's rights. Finally, overseas, those last several slides were dealing most with the United States, but we also see these same kind of student protests happening overseas. It's not focused as much on Vietnam, although that's a little of it, but really it's the young questioning what's going on in their countries in post-World War II Europe. We have a lot of young people. There's a huge baby boom after World War II. And so in the 1960s, we see these children coming of college age and really questioning some of the decisions that their elders are making as they run the countries. We want to really look at the fact that American and European youths are really questioning what's going on at the university system, too, and how they're treated by society. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the Cold War in the West. A lot of upheaval. This is really a time when societies are trying to reset themselves after this incredible wound of World War II, and so it's going to be a difficult time for a while. And this really lasts up until, especially in Europe, up until the 1990s, until we see people moving into a world that looks a lot more like ours, which is what we'll be talking about in the future.